If this week feels heavier than it should, there may be a reason for that. Not because something is wrong, and not because everything is about to change overnight, but because there are certain moments in the year that expose what you can no longer carry the same way. March 24th to 31st is one of those moments. It sits in that quiet space where almost nothing looks urgent, and yet something important is already taking shape underneath the surface. You may feel it as restlessness, as unusual honesty, or as the sense that something you kept calling uncertain is no longer as unclear as you wanted it to be. This week does not need to be loud to matter. In fact, what it changes tends to begin privately, before the rest of your life catches up to it. Most people do not take a week like this seriously, because it does not behave like the moments they have been taught to respect. It does not arrive loudly. It does not come with a major external event that forces everyone to stop, react, and adjust. There is no obvious alarm in it, no dramatic interruption, no clean emotional cue that says, "This matters now." And because of that, many people treat it like empty space. They assume the meaningful part is still ahead of them. They tell themselves they will get clear later, decide later, reset later, begin properly later. But weeks like this are often where later gets shaped. The quietest transitions are not always the least important ones. Very often, they are the ones where a person's direction changes without any performance around it at all. That is why the final stretch of any month can be deceptive, especially when it follows a real seasonal turn. The equinox has already passed, which means the year is no longer arranged in the same way it was even a short time ago. Day and night have reached that balancing point, and then tipped forward, giving longer daylight a more visible hold. Even for people who do not consciously think about astronomy, that kind of shift still changes the feel of life. Light reaches further into the evening. Morning takes on a slightly different quality. The body notices before the mind narrates. That does not mean every uneasy feeling is cosmic. It means human beings are more responsive to their environment than they often admit. A week can feel different simply because time itself feels different inside it. By March 24th, the change is subtle but real. This is the kind of day that exposes how often people confuse nothing dramatic is happening with nothing meaningful is happening. On the surface, routines may remain exactly the same messages, the same work, the same streets, the same conversations, the same familiar problems. But quiet turning points rarely arrive by changing your entire outer world first. They tend to begin as a change in the way you can no longer relate to things as casually as before. Something that felt tolerable last week may start feeling slightly out of place. Something unresolved may begin taking up more attention than it deserves. A thought you have been able to soften or postpone may start returning with more weight, not because it has grown bigger overnight, but because your tolerance for leaving it undefined is starting to shrink. That is where many people get confused. They expect an important shift to arrive with enthusiasm, urgency, or obvious momentum. They imagine that if a real change is beginning, it should feel clear in a loud way. But some of the most important changes begin as a quiet refusal. A refusal to keep over-explaining what is already plain. A refusal to keep carrying something just because it has been with you for a long time. A refusal to keep calling a delay uncertainty when the deeper issue is that the truth has already become inconvenient. This is what makes a week like this powerful. It does not push you into a new life all at once. It changes the texture of what you can continue tolerating in your current one. Then March 25th gives the week a more visible structure. The moon reaches first quarter, which means what was hidden in the dark phase of the previous week is now taking clear shape in the evening sky. That is not something that has to be exaggerated to matter. It is simply useful because it mirrors the emotional logic of this stretch. What recently felt vague starts becoming harder to keep vague. What recently sat in the background begins to take up more visible space. A first quarter moon does not look finished, but it is unmistakably there. It marks a movement away from invisibility toward definition. And the same thing often happens inwardly. A person does not necessarily receive a brand new answer here. More often, they lose the ability to pretend they do not already have one. That kind of clarity is not always pleasant. In fact, it can feel more exposing than exciting. It can feel like the end of a negotiation you have been having with yourself for too long. People often say they need more time, more information, or a better moment before they can really face something honestly. But sometimes none of those things are missing. Sometimes what is missing is simply the willingness to stop softening what has already become clear. That is what late March does so well. It does not need to create new drama. It only needs to reduce the emotional distance between you and what you already know. By March 26th, that reduction in distance can become very noticeable. This is often where a person starts hearing their own explanations differently. The same reasons that once helped them wait begin to sound thinner. The same patterns that once felt understandable begin to feel more costly. It is not that life has suddenly become less forgiving. It is that inner honesty has become harder to avoid. There is a kind of discomfort that comes from doing too much, and there is another kind that comes from carrying too many half-decisions. The second kind often hides better, but it drains more than people realize. It creates mental clutter, emotional drag, and a quiet friction that follows them into every other part of life. That is why a slower week matters. It gives you a chance to notice what is creating friction before everything speeds up around it. A thing does not need to become a crisis before it starts interfering with your momentum. Often, it becomes heavier, simply because life begins asking more from you, while it is still unresolved. What feels manageable in a reflective stretch can feel far more intrusive in an active one. That is one of the practical truths people ignore when they dismiss the last week of a month. They imagine the next phase will somehow make them feel more ready. But if something already feels unresolved in a quieter atmosphere, it rarely feels lighter once movement increases. This becomes especially clear around March 27th, because that is when many people start slipping into comparison without realizing it. The quarter is nearly over. The mind looks sideways. It wants to know where everyone else is, what everyone else has built, what everyone else seems to understand or have already begun. And this is where a lot of people lose the value of a week like this. Instead of listening to what is becoming accurate in their own life, they start reading themselves through someone else's timeline. They mistake visibility for truth. They assume that the loudest movement must be the most important one. But other people's pacing tells you almost nothing about your own season. What is public in someone else's life may be much less real than what is quietly forming in yours. Comparison is especially destructive during a quiet transition because it creates false urgency. It makes you feel late according to measures that were never truly yours. It makes you rush toward whatever looks defined, even if what actually needs your attention is something quieter and much closer to home. You cannot hear your own next step clearly while you are busy measuring your life against someone else's chapter. A week like this asks for a different kind of attention. Not wider attention, not louder attention, just truer attention. It asks whether you can notice what is already shifting in you before the world around you gives it a bigger name. By March 28th, the emotional logic of the week often becomes easier to see. This is the stage where people begin realizing that not every transition arrives with spectacle. Some of them arrive as a calm sharpening. Certain things feel less negotiable. Certain forms of confusion start looking less like mystery and more like avoidance. Certain habits of delay become harder to romanticize. None of this requires panic. In fact, panic would distort the value of the moment. The strength here is not in force. It is in accuracy. It is in finally seeing the difference between what is still alive enough to move forward with you and what has simply been lingering because there has been enough room to keep carrying it. That distinction matters because emotional weight is not always measured by how dramatic something feels. Sometimes the heaviest things are the ones that have been sitting in the background for too long without being named properly. They do not erupt, they accumulate. They follow you quietly into conversations, work, sleep, attention, and mood. They blur your focus in ways that are difficult to detect because they rarely look urgent. But a week like this has a way of exposing them by contrast. The environment is changing. The season is opening. The sky is visibly moving. And against that forward motion, whatever remains stagnant begins to stand out more clearly. By March 29th, the pressure of that contrast can become impossible to miss. Not because the day itself is inherently intense, but because a threshold feels different when you are close enough to hear it. This is where many people keep asking for one more sign when the clearest sign has already been their own repeated discomfort. If something has been circling your attention for too long, if the same issue keeps returning in different forms, if the same explanation no longer brings relief, that may be all the evidence you need. More time does not always create more truth. Sometimes it only creates more distance between what a person knows and what they are willing to live by. This is also the point where the visible movement overhead helps for a simple reason. It reminds you that the week itself is not standing still. The moon keeps changing position in the evening sky. Light continues lengthening. The month continues closing. Whether anyone responds consciously or not, the atmosphere is already moving toward a different pace. That matters because many people behave as if they are in neutral time. They are not. No one is. There are only periods where movement is louder and periods where movement is quieter. This is a quieter one, which is exactly why it is easier to use well if you recognize it while it is happening. By March 30th, the most useful thing is usually not a dramatic life overhaul. It is one honest adjustment. One thing that stops draining you because you have finally stopped bargaining with it. One place where you stop asking a dead loop to become meaningful again. One decision that clears space before the next phase begins asking more from you. This is where people often go wrong because they assume an important week must demand a huge, visible action. But often the deepest shift comes from something much smaller and much cleaner than that. A truthful withdrawal of energy can matter more than a loud new promise. A quiet decision can matter more than an emotional declaration. A clear internal "no more" can change far more than a dramatic external performance. What makes this so valuable is that no one may see it happening. There is very little audience around a week like this. There is no shared social pressure to announce that you are changing. No culturally dramatic label forcing you to act a certain way. No obvious milestone that expects a public gesture. And because of that, whatever honesty appears tends to belong to you in a deeper way. It is less contaminated by image, less driven by comparison, less shaped by the need to prove that something meaningful is happening. That is why quiet transitions can be more transformative than loud ones. They strip the process down to something more essential, what remains true when there is no performance left to hide inside. By March 31st, the emotional posture of the next phase has often already begun. Not in some absolute or mystical sense, but in a very human one. A person who has spent the week numbing themselves to what was becoming clear enters the new month with more drag than they realize. A person who has used the same stretch for inward honesty enters differently. Not because everything is solved, not because they have completed some perfect transformation, but because they are less divided against themselves, less burdened by what should have been named earlier, less dependent on a future date to grant them permission to become accurate. That is the difference people usually notice only in hindsight. They say something felt smoother, clearer, less heavy, and they struggle to explain why. Often the answer is not that something spectacular happened. It is that they met a quiet week properly while it was still quiet. They did not wait for the first of the month to begin listening to themselves. They did not confuse background time with meaningless time. They did not assume that only loud moments deserve seriousness. They recognized that some of the most important movement in life happens before the bigger chapter begins, when no one is watching, when almost nothing external has changed yet, and when the truest thing a person can do is stop carrying what no longer belongs to the version of them that is trying to move forward. By the time people realize a quiet turning point mattered, they are usually already living inside the shape it left behind. That is why this final stretch can feel so personal. It reaches inward first. It changes tolerance before circumstance. It sharpens honesty before momentum becomes visible. And if something in you has already become less willing to continue in the same blurred way, then that feeling may not be random at all. Some thresholds do not announce themselves with noise. Some of them arrive exactly like this, as a room going still, while something inside you quietly decides that what happens next cannot be entered in the same way as before.